Admiral Vortok had commanded military forces for 412 years. He had won 847 consecutive battles. He had conquered 23 star systems. He had never suffered a military defeat. He had never faced a tactical situation he could not overcome. He had established himself as the greatest military mind in known galactic history. His reputation was not based on luck or superior forces. His reputation was based on understanding something that most military commanders did not: the fundamental mechanics of how battles actually worked. Vortok understood that battles were decided through superior positioning, optimal resource allocation, predictive calculation of enemy responses, systematic elimination of tactical options, execution of flawlessly coordinated movements. These were the principles that governed warfare across the galaxy. These were the principles that Vortok had mastered completely. So when Vortok reviewed records of human military tactics, he was baffled. Human tactics violated every principle of proper warfare. Humans maintained inefficient positioning. Humans allocated resources based on values he did not understand. Humans made unpredictable decisions that should not have been possible to make under combat stress. Humans coordinated movements that should have been impossible to coordinate given their technological limitations. When Vortok was asked to comment on human military capability, his assessment was crushing: human tactics are primitive and inefficient. Humans win battles not through superior strategy, but through luck and accident. If humans ever faced an opponent that understood proper military science, they would be systematically destroyed. The analysis was published throughout the galaxy. Military academies across known space taught Vortok's assessment of human tactics as an example of what happened when a civilization lacked proper strategic understanding. Vortok dismissed humans as a military factor entirely, until he was invited to observe a human battle from inside the command center. The invitation commander Alexandra Park, understanding that human tactics were being globally mocked, decided to invite the galaxy's greatest military mind to observe a battle directly. The message she sent to Admiral Vortok was simple: Admiral, you have criticized human military tactics in your public analysis. I am inviting you to observe a human military engagement in real time from our command center. You will have complete access to all tactical displays, all communications, all strategic information. You will be able to judge human tactics not from external records but from direct observation. If you still believe our tactics are primitive after this observation, we will accept your judgment. If your assessment changes, perhaps the galaxy's military academies should revise their teaching. Vortok, secure in his analysis and confident that direct observation would only confirm his conclusions, accepted the invitation. He arrived at Earth Command Center with the expectation that he would observe a human military disaster in real time. The battle that Vortok was invited to observe was against a coalition military force attempting to capture a human mining settlement in the outer system. Coalition forces numbered 247 capital ships. Human forces numbered 63 ships. By every standard calculation, the coalition should have destroyed the human fleet in minutes. Vortok settled into the observation chair and watched the battle begin. The first thing he noticed was that human ships were not in optimal defensive formation. They were positioned in what he would have called a haphazard arrangement. Their spacing was inefficient. Their positioning left them vulnerable to flanking maneuvers. Vortok began to calculate how he would exploit this obvious vulnerability. But then something happened that disrupted his analysis. The coalition made a flanking maneuver, exactly as Vortok would have predicted. And the human fleet, despite their seemingly inefficient positioning, responded in a way that turned the coalition's tactical advantage into a disadvantage. Human ships moved in patterns that seemed chaotic but were actually perfectly coordinated to neutralize the coalition's maneuver. Vortok leaned forward, interest awakened. The complexity emerges as the battle progressed. Vortok began to recognize something in human tactics that he had not anticipated. The human positioning that he had initially dismissed as inefficient was actually designed to accommodate multiple possible enemy responses. The spacing that seemed wasteful was actually calculated to maintain communication and coordinated response across the fleet. The resource allocation that Vortok had called irrational was actually based on a calculation of pilot capability and ship limitations that he had not considered. The human commanders made decisions that violated standard tactical doctrine but seemed to anticipate coalition moves 3 to 4 steps in advance. Vortok suddenly realized that he had made a fundamental error in his analysis. He had evaluated human tactics from outside, assuming that standard military principles were universal. But humans were not following standard military principles. They were following different principles entirely. Human tactics were not primitive. They were alien to his understanding. The battle dynamics. As Vortok watched deeper into the battle, he began to understand what was actually occurring. Human commanders were making decisions based not on predictive calculation of enemy moves, but on something else entirely. They were making decisions based on understanding human psychology, human stress responses, human innovation under pressure. When a coalition maneuver should have forced human ships into a predetermined response pattern, humans instead made unexpected choices that exploited the coalition's assumption about how humans would react. Humans were not trying to predict enemy moves. Humans were trying to become unpredictable themselves. Vortok had spent 412 years assuming that predictability was a weakness to be eliminated. Humans, working with far more limited computational resources, had developed the opposite philosophy: make yourself so unpredictable that enemy prediction becomes impossible. The coalition was trying to solve a puzzle that had a correct answer. Humans were refusing to allow the puzzle to have a correct answer. The realization by the time the battle concluded, with human forces repelling the coalition assault despite their overwhelming numerical disadvantage, Vortok had understood something that would reshape his understanding of military science entirely. Human tactics were not primitive. They were based on entirely different assumptions about how warfare actually functioned. Vortok approached Commander Park after the battle ended. "I made an error in my analysis," Vortok said directly. "My assessment of human tactics as primitive was based on the assumption that military science was universal. I have now observed that human military science is fundamentally different from the principles I have mastered." Park waited for him to continue. "Your positioning was not inefficient. It was designed to accommodate your limitation in computational capability by maintaining human judgment as the central decision-making framework. Your resource allocation was not irrational. It was based on understanding pilot psychology in ways that my culture has not developed. Your tactical flexibility was not luck. It was the result of training human commanders to make unpredictable decisions under stress." Vortok looked directly at Park. "I spent 412 years believing that military science had been perfected. I have now realized that I had only perfected one version of military science. Humans have developed an entirely different version, based on human limitations becoming advantages." The deeper understanding. Vortok spent the next several weeks on Earth, studying human military doctrine and human tactical theory. What he discovered was that human tactics were not merely different. They represented a fundamentally different understanding of how warfare functioned. Standard military theory, which Vortok had mastered, assumed that warfare was a problem with an optimal solution. If you had superior information, superior computational capability, superior tactical positioning, you could calculate the optimal response and execute it perfectly. But humans operated from a different assumption: warfare was not a problem with an optimal solution. Warfare was a constant negotiation between unpredictable beings making decisions under stress, fear, and incomplete information. Therefore, the advantage did not go to the commander with the best calculation. The advantage went to the commander who understood human psychology best and who could create conditions where enemy assumptions would be violated. Vortok realized that his 412 years of military victories had been achieved against opponents who all shared his assumptions about how warfare worked. None of them had tried to become unpredictable. None of them had assumed that optimal calculation was less important than psychological understanding. Humans, lacking the computational resources to match their opponents, had developed tactics that turned that limitation into an advantage. The public recantation. Admiral Vortok returned to his home system and made an extraordinary public statement. "I am retracting my previous analysis of human military tactics," he announced to galactic media. "I stated that human tactics were primitive and inefficient. I was wrong." The statement continued with brutal honesty: "I was wrong because I assumed that my understanding of military science was universal. I was wrong because I evaluated human tactics against standards that humans were not attempting to meet. I was wrong because I judged human tactics by my own principles rather than by the principles humans were actually operating under." Vortok concluded with words that shocked the galaxy: "Human military tactics represent an approach to warfare that I have not encountered in 412 years. Their tactics are based on understanding human psychology, human adaptability, and human unpredictability as strategic assets. I have spent my entire military career trying to eliminate unpredictability. Humans have spent their military career trying to exploit unpredictability. Both approaches have merit. But humans have shown me something I did not know, that unpredictability can be more valuable than perfect calculation. The galactic response to the retraction of Vortok's assessment was met with shock and skepticism across the galaxy. Vortok had spent 4 centuries establishing his reputation as the greatest military mind in galactic history. His analysis had been taught in every military academy. His principles had shaped how hundreds of civilizations understood warfare. For him to suddenly recant that analysis was destabilizing. But Vortok supported the recantation with something more powerful than words. He requested to study under human military commanders. For the first time in his life, Vortok became a student rather than a teacher. And through that study, he began to understand something that would transform how the galaxy understood military science entirely. The synthesis over the next 5 years, Vortok and the human commanders developed something unprecedented, a synthesis of 2 completely different approaches to military science. The human approach to tactical unpredictability was combined with Vortok's understanding of strategic positioning and resource optimization. The result was a military doctrine that exceeded either approach individually. Military academies across the galaxy were forced to reconsider their teaching. Vortok's original principles of optimal calculation were acknowledged as valuable but incomplete. Human principles of psychological understanding and unpredictability were recognized as equally valuable but also incomplete. The synthesis suggested that truly effective military science required understanding both optimal calculation and human psychology, both systematic planning and adaptive response, both theoretical perfection and practical unpredictability. The unexpected consequence: the synthesis of military doctrines had an unexpected consequence. It transformed how the galaxy understood consciousness itself. If humans could develop a complete military science based on understanding psychology and unpredictability, what other aspects of galactic civilization might humans have insights into that other species lacked? The question prompted a broader reconsideration of human capability and human contribution across multiple domains. Species that had previously dismissed human tactical thinking as primitive suddenly began to study human approaches to governance, education, and social organization. What they discovered was that humans had developed approaches to these domains that were as revolutionary as their military tactics. Humans understood how to structure societies around adaptability rather than perfect planning. Humans understood how to educate beings for unpredictable futures rather than predetermined roles. Humans understood how to create resilience through diversity rather than through optimization. All of these approaches had emerged because humans lacked the computational resources and centralized control that other species possessed. Humans had turned limitation into advantage across multiple domains. The philosophical transformation: the revelation that human thinking represented a fundamentally different approach to solving complex problems, triggered a philosophical transformation across the galaxy. For centuries, the galaxy had assumed that advanced civilization operated through perfect information, optimal calculation, and systematic control. The goal was to eliminate randomness, to perfect planning, to eliminate unpredictability. Humans had demonstrated that this assumption was incomplete. Unpredictability was not something to be eliminated. It was something to be understood and exploited. Incomplete information was not a problem to be solved. It was a condition that could be adapted to. Human judgment, with all its flaws and inconsistencies, was not inferior to perfect calculation. It was different. The galaxy began a slow transformation toward approaches that incorporated human insights about adaptability, unpredictability, and the value of psychological understanding alongside systematic planning. The personal transformation: Admiral Vortok, now studying under human commanders rather than commanding with his own authority, recorded personal reflections on what he was learning. I spent 412 years believing that military science had been perfected. I spent those years refining my understanding of optimal tactics and perfect execution. I believed that the goal of military science was to reduce warfare to a calculation that could be solved. He paused. I have now learned that warfare is not a calculation that can be solved. Warfare is a dynamic interaction between beings who cannot be fully predicted, who make decisions based on psychology and stress and values that do not reduce to mathematical formulas. Vortok continued with what sounded like genuine humility. The human commanders have shown me that the greatest military minds are not those with the best calculations, but those who best understand human nature. I have spent 412 years becoming an expert in optimal calculation. I am now spending the remainder of my life learning to understand what humans have understood for millennia, that unpredictability is not a weakness but a feature of conscious beings. The legacy: by the time Admiral Vortok died, approximately 50 years after arriving on Earth, he had fundamentally transformed how the galaxy understood military science. His original principles of optimal calculation were no longer taught as gospel. Instead, military academies taught both Vortok's original approach and the human approach to military tactics that had forced him to reconsider. The greatest military commanders were now understood to be those who could synthesize both approaches, those who understood perfect calculation and human psychology, those who could plan systematically while remaining adaptable to unexpected circumstances, those who recognized that military science required both optimal theory and practical unpredictability. Vortok's final will specified that his personal records be available to human military academies. The records documented his 412-year career in military command, his analysis of over 8,000 battles from other species, and his documentation of how human tactical understanding had challenged and reshaped his understanding of military science. The galactic recognition: 200 years after Vortok's death, the galaxy formally recognized the contribution that humans had made to military science not through conquest or demonstration of power, but through forcing the galaxy's greatest military mind to reconsider his fundamental assumptions. The recognition stated, the human species contributed to galactic military science not by defeating superior opponents through military force, but by forcing recognition that military science was not universal. By demonstrating that psychological understanding and adaptability were as valuable as optimal calculation, humans forced a reformation of military doctrine across the galaxy. This contribution, achieved through quiet tactical innovation rather than through conquest, represents one of the most significant intellectual contributions to galactic civilization. The final reflection in historical records created centuries after Vortok's transformation, one question appeared repeatedly: what if Admiral Vortok had never come to Earth? What if he had maintained his original assessment of human tactics as primitive? The answer suggested by historians was that the galaxy might have continued operating under the assumption that advanced military science meant perfect calculation and systematic elimination of unpredictability. It was only through being forced to reconsider by a civilization that lacked computational resources that the galaxy recognized the value of the approaches humans had developed. The greatest military mind in galactic history had been humbled not by military defeat, but by exposure to a completely different approach to solving complex problems. And in that humbling, the galaxy had learned something crucial: that limitation could be transformed into advantage, that unpredictability could be more valuable than perfection, that the greatest innovations sometimes emerged from species that lacked the resources to develop conventional approaches.